Sebastian Hale grabbed Natalie's face with both hands in the back of that Midtown hotel suite and kissed her like his pregnant wife did not exist, like the nursery he had personally designed was not sitting 30 blocks away. Like Sophie 7 months along, carrying his daughter, trusting him completely, was nothing more than a detail he had forgotten to cancel. He laughed when Natalie whispered, "What about Sophie?" He actually laughed. Then he said 4 words that would cost him everything. Sophie isn't going anywhere. He was wrong. She was already gone. Before we go any further, if this is your first time here, please subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss a story. And drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Now let's go back to the beginning. The penthouse on the Upper West Side sat on the 34th floor of one of Manhattan's most private residential towers, the kind of building where the doorman remembered your dry cleaning preferences and your guests were vetted before they ever reached the elevator. From the floor-to-ceiling windows on a clear morning, you could see Central Park spread out like a green quilt stitched between glass and steel. It was the kind of view that made people stop mid-sentence. It was the kind of home that made people assume the people living inside it were happy. Sophie Hale had loved this apartment once. She had stood at those windows barefoot on the morning they moved in 7 years ago, pressing her palm flat against the glass, and she had thought, this is it. This is the life. Sebastian had come up behind her and wrapped both arms around her from behind his chin on her shoulder, and he had said quietly, like a promise, "Everything I do for this. For us." She had believed him completely. That was the version of Sebastian Hale she had married, the one who called her from Tokyo at 2 a.m. just to hear her voice, the one who sat through 4 hours of her rough-cut documentary footage and gave her notes that were actually useful, the one who cried, genuinely cried, when the doctor told them Sophie was finally pregnant after 2.5 years of trying. That man still existed somewhere inside the one sitting across from her at the breakfast table now. She could catch glimpses of him sometimes in the way he still put her coffee on her side of the island, before he poured his own, in the way he still reached for her hand in movie theaters, out of pure muscle memory. But muscle memory is not love, and a habit is not the same thing as a choice. Sophie was 38 years old. She had spent the better part of a decade making documentary films about people who told themselves comfortable lies. She had sat across from a man who swore he had never hit his wife with the woman's medical records in Sophie's hand. She had interviewed a politician who looked directly into her camera and described his integrity while his assistant stood just off frame, holding the phone with the evidence that would end his career. Sophie knew what it looked like when a person's face said one thing and their body said something else entirely. She had been watching her husband's body for months now. It started small. It always starts small. A phone that used to sit on the nightstand face-up, screen open, never a second thought, suddenly placed face down every single time. A man who used to complain that his business dinners ran too late, suddenly no longer complaining. A man who used to come to bed and reach for her, now coming to bed and reaching for his phone instead, scrolling in the dark until she pretended to fall asleep so she would not have to lie there feeling the distance between them like a third person in the room. She noticed the shift in his cologne first. Sebastian had worn the same scent for 9 years, something dark and warm, cedar and sandalwood, a bottle she used to steal sprays from when she missed him while he traveled. Around October, he started coming home smelling different, not dramatically different, just finished, freshly applied, like a man who had put cologne on twice in one day. She did not say anything. She filed it. Then came the name, Natalie Brooks. Sophie heard it for the first time on a Thursday evening in November when Sebastian was on a call in his home office, and she walked past the door to get a glass of water. The door was not quite closed. She was not eavesdropping. She simply heard the name float out through the gap like smoke under a door. Natalie pulled the numbers together. Sebastian was saying, his voice warmer than his usual business tone, carrying an undercurrent of something Sophie recognized immediately and wished she didn't. "Tell her I said good work. Actually, I'll tell her myself. Sophie stood in the hallway for 3 seconds. Then she went and got her water. Then she sat down on the edge of the bathtub in the master bath and breathed slowly through her nose the way her therapist had taught her, and she thought, do not react. Observe. You are a documentarian. This is footage. Collect the footage first. She was 7 months pregnant. Her daughter moved inside her like a slow tide. She pressed one hand to the side of her belly and felt a heel or maybe an elbow press back. And she thought, whatever comes next, this child comes first. Whatever I do it right. Over the next 3 weeks, Sophie collected the footage. She was careful. She had learned from years of investigative filmmaking that the worst thing you can do is tip off your subject before you have everything you need. She did not go through Sebastian's phone, not because she was afraid of what she'd find, but because she did not need to. She was smarter than that. She started paying attention to patterns instead of content, times, gaps, inconsistencies. Sebastian's assistant was a young man named Marcus, 26, fiercely loyal to Sebastian, but also, this was important, a genuinely decent person who was deeply uncomfortable with dishonesty. Sophie had known Marcus for 4 years. She knew that when Marcus was covering for something, he would touch the side of his neck with his left hand. It was an unconscious tell. Sophie had noticed it once during a surprise party planning, and again when Marcus had helped Sebastian cover a weekend boys' trip that ran a day longer than planned. In December, Marcus touched his neck 3 times in 1 week when Sophie asked simple, ordinary questions. Is Sebastian joining us for the Caldwell dinner? Touch. He mentioned something about a site visit Thursday. Do you know what time he'll be back? Touch. Did the car service mix up the accounts again? I saw a charge I didn't recognize. Touch. That was enough. Sophie called Elena Vasquez on a Wednesday afternoon while Sebastian was at a board meeting. Elena was Sophie's college roommate, her closest friend for 19 years, and professionally one of the sharpest family law attorneys in the state of New York. They had not spoken in depth in almost a year. Life had gotten loud on both sides. But when Sophie called and said, I need to talk to you about something, professionally and personally, and I need you to know right now that I am not falling apart. I am making a plan. Elena did not miss a single beat. I'm clearing my 3 o'clock, Elena said. Come in now. Sophie sat across from her oldest friend in a leather chair that had seen better days. Elena had always refused to redecorate her office, saying clients trusted battered furniture more than glossy credenzas. And she laid out everything she had observed over the previous 6 weeks. Dates, times, names, behavioral patterns. The cologne, the phone, Marcus's neck, the name Natalie Brooks. Elena listened without interrupting. She had a yellow legal pad in front of her, but she barely touched her pen. When Sophie finished, Elena was quiet for a moment. Then she said, You haven't confronted him. No. You're not going to. Not until I know everything. Elena nodded slowly. You want a private investigator. I want someone good, someone quiet, and I need you to tell me what my rights look like right now while I'm pregnant, if everything I suspect turns out to be true. Elena leaned back in her chair and looked at her friend, really looked at her the way you look at someone you've known through every version of themselves, and said quietly, Sophie, you know I have to ask, are you okay? Sophie's jaw tightened just slightly. I am going to be, she said. That's different from okay, but it's enough to work with. The investigator Elena recommended was a former federal agent named Richard Kowalski. 61 years old, former FBI now ran a small, extremely discreet private firm that handled exactly the kind of cases that never showed up in newspapers. He was not flashy. He did not promise results. He quoted Sophie a flat fee, told her his process, and said, If there's something to find, I'll find it. If there isn't, I'll tell you that too, and you'll owe me nothing for the honesty. Sophie wrote him a check from her personal account, an account Sebastian did not have access to, money from the residuals of a documentary she had sold to a streaming platform 3 years ago. Money she had always kept separate, without fully knowing why. The way some people keep a spare key in a drawer they hope they'll never need. Richard Kowalski came back to her in 11 days. He sat down across from her at a coffee table in Elena's office. Sophie had not wanted to risk meeting anywhere near the penthouse, and he opened a manila folder and placed it on the table between them, with the particular careful neutrality of a man who had done this many times and understood that the next 60 seconds would be significant. Sophie looked at the photographs. She read the dates and locations printed beneath them. She read the hotel names. She noted the timestamps on the documented encounters, 6 confirmed meetings over a 9-week period, 4 at a hotel in Midtown, 2 at a private residence in Brooklyn, that Richard had traced back to a corporate account connected to Sebastian's firm. She did not cry. She had done most of her crying in the shower at 3 in the morning alone during the weeks before she had confirmation, when she was still in the worst place a person can be, the place where you almost know, but don't quite yet, where hope and dread sleep in the same bed. Now she knew, and knowing she discovered was strangely quieter than not knowing. She closed the folder. She pushed it back across the table toward Richard. She said, "Thank you." Then she turned to Elena and said, "Now tell me everything." What followed over the next 10 days was the most disciplined and focused work Sophie Hale had ever done in her life, and she had once spent 14 months undercover filming a story about corporate environmental fraud, while 8 different lawyers threatened to bury her. She worked systematically. She documented everything Richard had given her in a format that could be used legally. She worked with Elena on the structure of what a separation would look like, what she was entitled to, what the prenuptial agreement actually said, versus what Sebastian had always implied it said, what her daughter's rights were before she was even born. She also made practical arrangements. She called her closest friend from her documentary days, a woman named Kara, who lived on a farm property in Vermont and had been begging Sophie to come visit for 2 years. She did not explain everything. She said only, "I'm going to need somewhere safe and quiet to finish out my pregnancy. I'm going to need you to not ask a lot of questions until I get there. Can you do that?" Kara said, "My guest room's been waiting for you. Come whenever." She packed nothing visible. She did not buy new things, did not order anything to the penthouse, did not give Sebastian any reason to notice a shift in her patterns. She moved like a woman who had learned to move carefully around something fragile, except the fragile thing was no longer her marriage, it was her exit. Then on a Saturday afternoon, while Sebastian was at a lunch meeting that Richard had confirmed was for once entirely legitimate, Sophie moved a small duffel bag to Elena's office. Inside her passport, her laptop, a hard drive with her personal financial records, copies of every document Richard had given her, her prenatal records, a phone that was not on the family plan, a change of clothes, and a small framed photograph she had taken off the shelf in her home office herself at 24, standing in front of a camera in a dusty field somewhere in New Mexico, laughing at something off-frame, looking like a person who had not yet learned the difference between loving someone and trusting them. She was almost ready. She chose Tuesday because Sebastian had board meetings every Tuesday from 7:45 in the morning until well past noon. She knew his schedule the way she knew her own heartbeat. After 11 years of marriage, his rhythms had become part of hers. She knew he would leave at 7:15. She knew Marcus would pick him up at the curb, not upstairs. She knew the apartment would be empty and quiet, and hers for however long she needed. On Monday night, she cooked dinner. She made the pasta carbonara that had been their first meal together. She used to joke that she had seduced him with carbs, and she opened a bottle of expensive sparkling water because she could not drink wine. And they sat at the dining table, and Sebastian talked about the Q1 projections, and she listened and laughed at the right moments and asked questions, and was she thought giving the performance of her career. At 9:30, Sebastian said he was going to turn in early. He kissed her forehead the way you kiss someone out of habit, without looking at them, and walked to the bedroom, and Sophie sat alone at the dining table for a while, her hands around her glass, feeling the weight of the evening settle over her like a coat she was about to leave behind. She thought about the woman she had been when she moved into this apartment. How certain she had been, how willing, how completely she had believed in the story she and Sebastian were telling together. She thought about Audrey, the name they had chosen together, laughing in the hospital after one of the early scans, Sebastian suggesting names with the same chaotic enthusiasm he brought to everything he loved. Audrey, he had said, like Hepburn, because she's going to be the most elegant woman in any room she walks into. Sophie had rolled her eyes and said she'd think about it, and then that night she had lain in bed and thought, yes, Audrey. The baby was still Audrey. That had not changed. On Tuesday morning, Sophie woke at 6. She showered, she dressed, she went to the kitchen and made herself a breakfast. She actually tasted eggs, toast, fresh fruit, and she sat at the island and ate it slowly, watching the pale winter light come through the windows. Sebastian came in at 6:50, already dressed, distracted, phone in hand. "You're up early," he said, not quite looking at her. Couldn't sleep, she said pleasantly. How's the morning looking? Brutal, he said. He poured a coffee. He looked at his phone. He said, Might be a long one. Don't wait up for dinner. Okay, she said. Have a good day. He kissed her forehead again. She held very still. She smelled that cologne, the new one, and she thought the last time, this is the last time. She watched him walk to the elevator. She watched the doors close. Then she sat quietly at the island for exactly 7 minutes, the way a person sits when they are making sure something is truly finished. Then she stood up, rinsed her plate, and walked to the bedroom. She had one thing left to do. She sat at the writing desk in the corner of the room, the small antique one she had found at a flea market in Paris on their 5th anniversary, and she took out a single piece of paper and a pen, and she wrote 4 lines. She did not draft them. She had been writing them in her head for 3 weeks, and she knew exactly what they said. She placed the note on the center of the bed. She smoothed the paper flat with one hand. She looked at it for a moment. Then she picked up the duffel bag she had brought home from Elena's office the night before, slipped it over her shoulder, walked out of the master bedroom, crossed the living room without stopping, and pressed the elevator button. The doors opened. She stepped in. She did not look back at the apartment. She did not need to. The elevator descended, and Sophie Hale, 7 months pregnant, entirely clear-eyed, more herself than she had been in years, stepped out into the marble lobby, nodded once to the doorman who had known her for 6 years, walked through the glass doors, and got into a car that Elena had arranged. As the car pulled away from the curb and moved uptown toward the highway that would take her north, Sophie placed one hand on her belly. Audrey moved that slow, rolling tide. I know, Sophie said softly to no one and to everything. We're going. The note on the bed said 4 things. Sebastian would read it in approximately 7 hours. By the time he did, Sophie would be in Vermont. By the time he understood what it meant, the world he had built, the penthouse, the empire, the carefully managed image, the woman who had made it all feel real, would already be gone. Not destroyed, not burned down. Simply, quietly, irrevocably, no longer his. Sebastian Hale walked through the front door of the penthouse at 6:47 that Tuesday evening, feeling the particular kind of tired that comes not from work, but from pretending. The board meeting had run long. Then there had been a call with the Singapore office. Then Natalie had texted twice. He had not answered either message, which was unusual, and the silence between them felt like something he would deal with tomorrow. He was good at dealing with things tomorrow. He had built an entire life on the skill of postponing discomfort. He dropped his keys on the marble island. He loosened his tie. He called out Sophie's name the way you call out a name when you already expect an answer, not really listening, just filling the air. No answer came back. He assumed she was in the nursery. She had been spending more time in there lately, organizing and reorganizing, the small things, the folded blankets, the tiny shoes arranged by size on the shelf, the soft mobile she had chosen herself after 2 hours of comparing options online. Sebastian had teased her about that once. It's a mobile Soph. The baby can't even see it yet. Sophie had not looked up from the shelf. She had said very quietly, I know, but I can see it. He had not known what to do with that answer at the time. He knew now it meant something he had not been paying enough attention to. He poured himself 2 fingers of scotch. He checked his phone. He walked to the hallway and called her name again, louder this time. The nursery was empty. He stood in the doorway of the small yellow room. Sophie had chosen the color herself, a soft, warm yellow she called early morning, and the stillness of it hit him somewhere below the rib cage. The mobile turned slowly in the air from the central vent. Everything was in its place. Everything was ready. But the room had the particular quality of a room that has been prepared and then abandoned, and Sebastian felt the first thread of unease pull taut somewhere in his chest. He went to the master bedroom. The note was on the center of the bed, exactly where Sophie had placed it, smoothed flat, a single sheet of white paper in her handwriting, the precise, unhurried cursive she had developed during years of fieldwork when she needed to record things quickly and legibly. He did not pick it up immediately. He stood at the foot of the bed and read it from where he stood. The way you read something when some part of you already knows you are not going to like it, and is trying to buy one final second of not knowing. 4 lines. I know everything, Sebastian. I have known for weeks. I am leaving to protect myself and our daughter. Please do not look for me. Let me go. Let. He read it 3 times. He counted the words without meaning to. He had always processed shock through small, useless tasks. A habit from childhood, his mother counting tiles on the kitchen floor, while his father's voice came through the wall. He read the note 3 times, and then he sat down on the edge of the bed, and he held it in both hands, and he felt the full weight of what those 4 lines actually meant crash into him, the way cold water hits a sleeping person, total physical, immediate no mercy. She knew. She had known for weeks, while he sat across from her at breakfast, while she laughed at his jokes at dinner, while she let him kiss her forehead every morning, like a man who had earned that small gesture of trust. While he was on the phone with Natalie, while he was lying to Marcus, while he was constructing the careful fiction of a man who had everything under control, Sophie had been watching. Sophie had been documenting. Sophie had been building her exit with the same quiet precision she brought to every project she had ever cared about. He stood up suddenly. He walked to her closet. Her closet was 3/4 full. Her clothes were still there, the dresses, the coats, the shoes lined up in their rows. For one irrational second, his chest unknotted slightly, because the clothes were there, she had not taken her clothes, which meant... And then he stopped himself, because he knew Sophie. He knew exactly who she was, and a woman like Sophie did not need to take her wardrobe to make a statement. She had taken what mattered. She had left everything decorative behind. He went to her desk, the small antique one from Paris. The surface was clear. The photograph that usually sat in the upper left corner, Sophie at 24, laughing in a field somewhere, was gone. He sat down in her chair and put his face in his hands. He stayed like that for a long time. His phone buzzed. He did not look at it. It buzzed again. He turned it face down on the desk without looking, the same gesture he realized with a nauseating jolt of self-awareness that Sophie had watched him make hundreds of times. He sat in her chair and breathed and tried to think clearly through the noise of his own thoughts. The first thing he did, the first real, deliberate thing, was call Marcus. Marcus picked up on the second ring. "Mr. Hale." "Marcus." Sebastian's voice came out wrong, too controlled, the voice of a man gripping something tightly to keep from dropping it. "Did you know about Sophie?" A silence on the other end, long enough to be its own answer. "Marcus." "Sir, I didn't know the details. I swear to you, I didn't know the details." "But you knew something." Another silence. Then, "I knew she seemed like she was preparing for something. About 3 weeks ago, she asked me some questions and I answered them the way I always do. I didn't think..." "What did she ask you?" "She asked about the Singapore trip, whether the meetings were real." A beat. "They were real, sir." "I know they were real." Sebastian pressed 2 fingers to his temple. "What else?" "She asked about the Thursday site visit in November. She said you'd mentioned it and she was trying to plan around your schedule." Marcus's voice dropped slightly. "I told her it was confirmed. It was on the books." The Thursday site visit in November, the one that had run 4 hours longer than it should have because Sebastian had not actually been at a site. He had been in Brooklyn. He knew the date precisely because it was the first time. The first time he had told himself it was manageable, it was controlled, it would not cost him anything. "Marcus," Sebastian said, "did she seem upset when she asked these things?" "No," Marcus said, and there was something in his voice, a careful quality, like a man choosing each word precisely. "That's the thing, sir. She didn't seem upset at all. She seemed focused." Sebastian closed his eyes. Focused was the right word. He knew Sophie focused. He had watched her in documentary mode, the way she became absolutely still, the way her questions became shorter and more precise, the way she stopped reacting and started recording. He had always admired it in her work. He had never once considered that she might turn it on him. He ended the call with Marcus and sat alone in the master bedroom for another 10 minutes. Then he called Elena Vasquez. Elena's phone went to voicemail on the first ring. Not the second. The first, which meant it had been declined. He called again. Voicemail again, first ring. He put the phone down. He stared at it. Of course. Elena. Sophie's oldest friend, one of the sharpest family attorneys in the state. Elena would have been part of this. Had probably been part of this for weeks. The voicemail told him everything Elena knew Sophie had left, and Elena had no intention of answering Sebastian's calls tonight or any other night until Sophie decided what happened next. He felt the walls of his controlled world pressing in from every side simultaneously. He poured another scotch he did not drink. He stood at the window. The window Sophie had pressed her palm against 7 years ago, barefoot laughing, and he looked out at the park spread below and thought about the last time he and Sophie had felt like the same team. He tried to find the exact moment. He could not. That was the thing about gradual erosion. You never feel the ground shifting under you until you look down and realize you are standing somewhere completely different from where you started. His phone buzzed with a text from Natalie. He looked at the screen. "Dinner tonight, I picked somewhere quiet." He stared at the message for a long moment. Then he put the phone face down again. He did not answer. He did not know how to answer, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, he did not want to. Across town in the sleek apartment that the corporate account paid for, Natalie Brooks was sitting on her couch with a glass of wine, watching her phone not respond, and beginning to feel the first edge of something she had been successfully avoiding for 3 months, the suspicion that she was not in a complicated situation. She was in a lie, and the lie was not hers. She had not gone looking for this. She needed herself to remember that sometimes when the guilt came, she had been hired as a financial consultant on one of Sebastian's major restructuring deals. She was 29, she was good at her job. She had not walked into that first business dinner planning anything except to make a strong professional impression. Sebastian had been charming was too small a word. He had been magnetic. He had listened to her with a quality of attention that felt she knew now practiced. He had told her the marriage was complicated, that he and Sophie were more partners than anything else, that they had stayed together out of obligation, out of shared history that Sophie understood, that Sophie knew. Natalie had believed him. She had told herself she was not the kind of woman who did things like this. Then she had done it anyway, and somewhere between October and December, she had stopped asking questions about Sophie, because asking the questions meant confronting answers she was not ready for. But tonight, with Sebastian's phone silent and the news on low in the background, something made Natalie open her laptop and search Sophie Hale's name, something she had carefully avoided doing for months, the way you avoid looking at a wound, because looking makes it real. What came back stopped her cold. Sophie Hale was not, as Sebastian had described her, a woman who had quietly stepped back from her career to manage their life together. Sophie Hale was an award-winning documentary filmmaker with 3 major credits to her name, a Peabody nomination, and a profile in a film magazine from 2 years ago that described her as one of the most precise and fearless investigators working in documentary today. The photograph in the profile showed a woman with dark eyes and a direct gaze, the kind of gaze that saw through things. Natalie read the profile twice. She set her wine glass down. She felt something cold settle over her that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. Sebastian had told her Sophie was delicate, that Sophie needed protecting from difficult truths, that Sophie lived in the penthouse in a kind of gilded passivity, dependent and comfortable. The woman in this magazine article was none of those things. Natalie closed the laptop. She sat very still. She thought about every conversation she and Sebastian had ever had in which Sophie's name had come up. She thought about the way he had steered those conversations, the quick pivots, the careful reframings, the way he always managed to make Sophie sound like a background character in her own marriage. She thought, I have been played. Not the way she had been half suspecting, not played by a man who was simply stringing 2 women along. Played more completely than that. She had been handed a fiction designed specifically to make her feel like the reasonable choice, the logical development, the natural next chapter. Sebastian had not cheated on Sophie with her. He had used her, her ambition, her intelligence, her willingness to believe a story that was convenient to build himself an exit from a marriage. He was too much of a coward to leave honestly. She picked up her phone. She typed, "We need to talk, not about dinner." She stared at the message for 3 seconds, then she deleted it. She put the phone face down on the cushion. She stared at the ceiling. Outside Manhattan was doing what Manhattan always does, moving indifferent enormous, and in the penthouse 30 blocks north, Sebastian Hale had not moved from Sophie's desk chair in 40 minutes. He finally called his advisor. a man named Jonathan Park, 63, who had been with Sebastian's firm for 14 years and who had the particular quality of a person who had seen everything and reacted to nothing. Jonathan answered on the third ring. "I need you to find out if Sophie is safe," Sebastian said without preamble. "Not where she is, just whether she's safe. Can you do that?" A pause. "I can make calls. Do it tonight." Sebastian. Jonathan's voice was measured, careful. "Do you want to tell me what happened?" "She left." The two words landed in the air of the empty penthouse like something dropped from a height. "She found out, and she left." A long silence from Jonathan. Not the silence of shock. Jonathan did not shock easily, but the silence of a man who is recalibrating, who is running through implications. Then, "Are you going to make this worse?" What does that mean? It means, are you going to call lawyers tonight? Are you going to start putting pressure on finding her because if she left on her own safely with a plan, the worst thing you can do right now is make it a legal battle. She is 7 months pregnant, Sebastian. Whatever you do in the next 48 hours will define how this entire situation unfolds. Sebastian pressed his fingers to his eyes. "I'm not going to do anything tonight." "Good." A beat. "I'll find out if she's safe. That's all you need to know right now." He hung up. He sat in Sophie's chair. He looked at the note he was still holding in his right hand, 4 lines unhurried cursive, the handwriting of a woman who had written it without a single crossed-out word. Not a draft, not a final version of something she had struggled to say, just the truth written cleanly the first time. "Please do not look for me. Let me go." He had spent his entire adult life in the belief that there was no situation he could not manage. Every crisis he had ever faced, failed deals, hostile takeovers, the lawsuits that came with the territory of his industry, the relationships that had frayed before. Sophie, all of it had been manageable because he had resources, strategy, and the fundamental certainty that enough pressure applied in the right place could move anything. Money moved things. Influence moved things. The right phone call moved things. He looked at those 4 lines and understood with a totality that was almost physical that none of that applied here. There was no call to make. There was no pressure that would help. The only power he had ever genuinely held in his marriage, Sophie's trust, was gone. And unlike a business deal, unlike a lawsuit, unlike anything else he had ever lost, it had not been taken from him. He had handed it away carefully over months, one small betrayal at a time, never believing the account could actually run to 0. The account was empty. Jonathan called back at 10:43. "She's safe," he said. "She's with a friend. I won't tell you more than that." "Is she the baby?" "Both are fine. She is being cared for." A pause. "Sebastian, go to sleep. Tomorrow is going to be a different kind of day." Sebastian did not sleep. He sat in the penthouse, his $30 million penthouse with the park view and the prepared nursery and the mobile turning slowly in the air, and he did not sleep, and the apartment that had always felt like proof of his success felt instead like the world's most expensive demonstration of everything he had failed to understand about what actually mattered. At 2 in the morning, a text came in from Natalie. "I did some reading tonight. About Sophie. We should not talk anymore. I think you know why. I'm withdrawing from the project. I'm sorry for my part in this." He read the message. He put the phone down. He did not reply. There was nothing to say. Natalie had arrived at the truth the same way Sophie had not through him, because he had never once offered it willingly. But around him, past the carefully constructed version of events he had handed both of them, past the convenient story and the practiced charm, straight through to the actual facts. Both women, independently on the same night, had seen through everything he had built. He was alone in a penthouse full of evidence of a life he had been dismantling for months without ever admitting that was what he was doing. And somewhere in Vermont, his wife was sleeping, or trying to sleep in a quiet room far from the city and the marble and the 34th floor view, with their daughter still weeks away from being born with her laptop and her documents and her legal strategy, and her oldest friend in the next room, and he realized with a clarity that felt like being turned inside out, completely fine without him. That was the part he could not escape. Not the betrayal he could have managed guilt. He was experienced with guilt. Guilt was something you carried and learned to set down in pieces. What he could not escape was the recognition that Sophie had not collapsed. Sophie had not shattered. Sophie had looked at the wreckage of their marriage and made a spreadsheet. She had looked at betrayal and made a plan. She had looked at the man she had trusted for 11 years and recognized, with the same documentary filmmaker's clarity that had made her career, that the story was over. And then she had filed the footage, packed one bag, and walked out into her own life, as if she had always known exactly where it was located. He had always admired that quality in her. He had just never imagined it would be turned on him. The park below the window was dark and still. The mobile in the nursery turned. The apartment breathed around him the hum of appliances, the distant sound of the city, the enormous quiet of a space built for two that now contained only one. Sebastian Hale. 41 years old, billionaire architect of deals that moved markets, a man who had never in his adult life felt genuinely powerless, sat in his $30 million apartment and felt for the first time the precise weight of everything he had thrown away. It was not a dramatic feeling. It was not a movie moment. It was quiet and total and absolute, the way the most significant things usually are. He held the note in both hands until the paper was warm from his skin. And he let himself understand that he was not going to fix this tonight. He was not going to fix this with a call or a strategy or a check. The only thing that might matter now was what he did next. Not what he said, not what he offered. What he actually did over however much time Sophie decided it would take, if she ever decided. That was the question he could not answer, and for the first time in his life, he did not have the power to make the answer come faster. The drive to Vermont took 4 hours and 20 minutes. Sophie slept for most of it, not the shallow, restless sleep she had been living on for weeks in the penthouse, but the deep, involuntary sleep of a body that has been holding itself rigid for too long and has finally been given permission to let go. The driver Elena had arranged was a quiet man in his 50s who asked no questions and kept the heat at exactly the right temperature and did not once look in the rearview mirror with the particular curiosity that Sophie had learned to recognize and dread. He simply drove, and Sophie slept. And somewhere in the middle of Connecticut, between the city and whatever came next, her daughter moved inside her, long and slow and deliberate, like a period at the end of a sentence, and Sophie, half asleep, pressed her palm to her side and held it there and breathed. Kara Mitchell was standing on the porch when the car pulled up. She did not run out. She did not make a production of it. She was simply there, 41 years old. Sophie's oldest friend from their documentary days, a woman who had filmed conflict zones and boardroom collapses and 3 separate natural disasters, and who therefore understood better than almost anyone the particular look on a person's face when they have come through something significant and are not yet ready to talk about all of it. She looked at Sophie getting out of the car, and she said only, "You look exhausted and you look free. Come inside. Bye, mao mam bc." Sophie laughed. It came out rough, like a sound that had been stored somewhere unused. "That's the most accurate thing anyone said to me in months," she said. Kara took the duffel bag without asking. "Guest room's warm," she said. "I made soup. You don't have to tell me anything tonight." "I will eventually." "I know." Kara held the door. "But tonight you just eat and sleep. Everything else can wait until morning." Sophie stepped inside. The door closed behind her, and that was that. Back in Manhattan, Sebastian woke on Wednesday morning, if woke was even the right word, for what happened when a man who has not slept properly emerges from a few hours of something that was more like unconsciousness than rest, to 17 unread messages, 4 missed calls, and a penthouse that had not gotten any less empty overnight. The messages were from various people: his CFO with a question about the Singapore timeline, his publicist, which was strange, he had not expected his publicist asking him to call before 10, 2 associates from the board, and Marcus, who had sent a single message at 7:15 that said only, "Sir, your 9 o'clock has been moved to 10. Let me know if you need anything." He called his publicist first because the publicist calling unprompted was never good news. Her name was Diane Foster, sharp 60. The kind of woman who had managed crises for people far messier than Sebastian, and who never called without a reason that justified the call. She picked up on the first ring. "There's a story," she said without greeting. "Not published yet. A financial column, someone is working on a piece about the restructuring deal, and they've started asking questions about Natalie Brooks's involvement in the project. It's not about the personal element yet, but these things have a way of, "How long do we have?" Sebastian said. "If it's the reporter, I think it is 48 to 72 hours before he starts making calls to people closer to you." A beat. "Sebastian, is there anything I need to know before I start managing this?" He was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that is itself an answer. "Sophie left," he said. Diane did not gasp. She did not express sympathy. She was a professional, and professionals in moments like this gather information before they react. "When?" "Yesterday morning." "Does anyone know yet?" "Jonathan, Marcus, Elena Vasquez, Sophie's attorney." "Sophie has an attorney." Not a question. A recalibration. "She had one before she left." He said it without inflection because there was no inflection available that would have made it sound better. "She was prepared, Diane. She planned this for weeks." Another silence, longer this time. Then Diane said something he did not expect. "Good for her." She caught herself immediately. I'm sorry. That was unprofessional. What I mean is, if she was prepared, if she has counsel, if she left on her own terms, then this is actually more manageable than the alternative. A woman disappearing in crisis is a headline. A woman who left with a plan is a private matter. A pause. "For now. Is she somewhere safe?" "Yes." "Do you know where?" "No, and I'm not looking." Diane was quiet for a moment, and he could almost hear her reassessing him through the phone, recalculating the way she always did, the gap between the man she worked for and the man she was talking to right now. "Okay," she said finally. "Here's what we do. Nothing. Today, you do nothing. You go to work. You behave exactly as normal. You let me monitor the situation with the reporter, and if the story breaks before we're ready, we get ahead of it on our terms. Understood?" "Understood." "And Sebastian," her voice shifted just slightly, just enough, "whatever you're feeling right now, keep it off your face today. You are walking into that office as the man who has everything under control, even if that is the least true thing in your life at this moment." He went to the office. He sat through the 10 o'clock. He answered questions about Singapore. He approved 2 budget amendments. He had a 40-minute call with a London partner that he navigated on autopilot, his voice doing the work while his mind stayed in the penthouse, stayed on the note, stayed on the image of that clear desk with the photograph missing. He was by every external measure functional. He was also by every internal measure somewhere else entirely. At 11:40, Jonathan Park appeared in his office doorway without knocking, which was unusual because Jonathan always knocked. Sebastian looked up. Jonathan's face said something was happening. "Close the door," Sebastian said. Jonathan closed the door. He sat down across the desk, the chair that visiting partners usually occupied, and he placed both hands flat on his knees, the way he did when he was choosing his words precisely. "I got a call this morning," he said, "from someone I trust at Whitmore Capital." Whitmore Capital was the firm co-funding the major restructuring deal, the deal on which Natalie Brooks had been the lead financial consultant. "They've been contacted by a reporter," Jonathan continued. "The reporter is asking questions about the consulting arrangements on the deal, specifically, and this is the part you need to hear clearly specifically, about whether any consulting contracts were awarded based on criteria outside the professional scope." Sebastian's jaw tightened. "Who's the reporter?" Jonathan told him. It was the name Diane had suspected. The same man who had broken 2 major financial stories in the past 18 months, both of which had resulted in SEC inquiries. He was not a gossip columnist. He was not interested in celebrity marriages or personal drama. He was interested in financial irregularity, and once he started pulling a thread, he did not let go. "He doesn't have the personal story yet," Jonathan said, "but the professional story and the personal story are attached to the same thread. If he pulls hard enough on one, he gets both." Sebastian pressed his knuckles against his mouth for a moment. "Has Natalie been contacted?" "Not that we know of. But she withdrew from the project yesterday. That kind of sudden withdrawal, if someone's paying attention, is its own signal." Sebastian thought about Natalie's text from the night before. "I'm withdrawing from the project." He had assumed it was purely personal, a woman removing herself from a situation that had turned painful. He had not considered that she might also be protecting herself professionally, preemptively, before the story broke. He had underestimated her. He had been underestimating everyone around him for months. "What does Whitmore want to do?" Sebastian asked. "They want a call, today. They want assurances that the consulting arrangements were entirely above board professionally, and that any personal complications will not create regulatory exposure for their investment." "Set up the call for 2 o'clock, Sebastian said. "And Jonathan, get our compliance team to pull every contract and communication related to Natalie's work on this deal. Everything. I want it clean and documented before that call." Jonathan nodded. He stood. He moved toward the door and then stopped, hand on the frame, and turned back. He looked at Sebastian with the expression of a man who had worked alongside him for 14 years and had therefore earned the right to say things that other people wouldn't. "You know," he said, "in all the years I've been doing this, I have never once seen a situation where the personal and the professional collapsed at exactly the same moment that couldn't have been prevented by a single honest conversation at the start." Sebastian said nothing. Jonathan nodded once as if that non-answer confirmed something. Then he left. In Vermont, Sophie was sitting at Kara's kitchen table with her laptop open, a mug of tea going cold beside her, and Elena's voice coming through her phone speaker in the calm, methodical cadence of a woman walking someone through a plan they had already agreed to but needed to hear again out loud. "The prenuptial agreement has 3 key provisions that work in your favor," Elena was saying. "The independent asset clause, which protects everything you earned before the marriage. The conduct clause, which, and I want you to really hear this, Sophie, which is specifically triggered by documented infidelity. And the child welfare provision, which gives you considerable leverage regarding primary custody arrangements in the event of a separation." Sophie was making notes. Not because she would forget, but because writing things down was how she processed it had been true since college, since her first documentary, since the first time she had sat across from a source and realized that the act of recording forced her to listen more carefully. "What's our timeline?" she said. "That depends entirely on what you want the next step to be," Elena said. "I'm not going to push you, but I need you to understand that the moment Sebastian retains counsel, which, if I know anything about the man's instincts, will happen within the next 72 hours, the dynamic shifts. Right now, you have the advantage of having moved first." "He's not going to fight me," Sophie said. She said it not as a hope, but as an assessment. She knew Sebastian. She knew the way his mind worked. He was calculating, yes, but he was also underneath everything someone who understood when a situation was unwinnable. He's going to try to find a way to manage the situation that costs him as little as possible publicly. "Probably," Elena agreed, "which is why I want you to let me reach out to his counsel before he has a chance to establish the terms." "Give it one more day," Sophie said. "Let him sit with it." A pause. "You're giving him time to feel it." "I'm giving him enough time that when the conversation starts, he already knows he can't negotiate his way out of it." Sophie closed the laptop. "He needs to understand that this is not a deal. There is no counteroffer. There are only my terms or no terms." Kara appeared in the doorway, caught Sophie's eye, and held up a plate with a sandwich on it. Sophie smiled genuinely, the way she hadn't smiled in what felt like a very long time, and nodded. Kara set the plate down and disappeared without a word. That was friendship, Sophie thought, not the performance of support, just the sandwich placed quietly without making it a moment. "Elena," she said, "one more day, then we move." By 2 o'clock that afternoon, Sebastian was on the call with Whitmore Capital, and it was going about as well as a call can go when the person on the other end is a 60-year-old institutional investor who has spent 4 decades watching talented people make avoidable mistakes. The man's name was Gerald Whitmore, the founding partner's son, which was how he had the name and the firm's actual operational brain, which was how he had the power. He was polite. He was precise, and he asked questions that had the quality of a surgeon's incision, small targeted, designed to reach the thing underneath without making more of a mess than necessary. "I want to be clear," Gerald said, "that Whitmore's concern here is entirely about professional integrity and regulatory exposure. Whatever is happening in your personal life, Sebastian, is your business. What is my business is whether this deal is clean. The deal is clean, Sebastian said. Every consulting contract awarded on this project was reviewed by our compliance team and approved through standard channels. Natalie Brooks was recommended by 2 independent board members who had no knowledge of any personal relationship. Her work product has been reviewed and signed off by 3 senior analysts. There is no regulatory exposure. And her withdrawal yesterday, a pause of exactly the right length. Personal reasons, Sebastian said. Unrelated to the project. I've already identified a replacement consultant who can step in without disrupting the timeline. Gerald was quiet for a moment. Then, I'm going to take you at your word, Sebastian, because in 14 years of working together, you have never given me a reason not to. But I want you to understand something. His voice did not change temperature. It stayed measured, even professional, but the words themselves shifted slightly. The moment this becomes a headline, personal or professional, my board will require a full review, and a full review takes 6 weeks minimum, which puts the Singapore closing at risk. It won't become a headline. People say that, Gerald said, right up until it does. The call ended at 2:47. Sebastian sat back in his chair and stared at the ceiling of his office for approximately 30 seconds. Then he called Diane. "How are we looking?" he said. "The reporter made 2 more calls this afternoon," she said. Neither of the people he called told him anything useful, but Sebastian, he's getting closer to the personal angle. Someone talked, not a lot, but enough. Who? I don't know yet. It could be anyone. A hotel employee, someone at the Brooklyn property. These things always have a leak point, and we rarely find out where it was until after. A pause. There's something else. He waited. Sophie's name has come up in one of the reporter's queries. Not in connection with the affair, he doesn't have that explicitly. But he asked one of his sources whether Sophie Hale had been seen recently, whether she had appeared at any of the usual events. Diane's voice was careful. He's noticing her absence, and a woman who disappears from public life at 7 months pregnant it's a detail that raises questions. Sebastian felt the situation tighten around him from a new direction. He had been so focused on the personal wreckage on Sophie's note on Natalie's withdrawal on the weight of the night before that he had not fully calculated the public dimension. Sophie disappearing was not just a private collapse. Sophie disappearing was a story. And if that story connected to Natalie's sudden withdrawal from the project, it became a much larger story than either element alone. He needed to talk to Sophie. He knew she had said, "Don't look for her." He knew she had said, "Let me go." He had no intention of violating those words, not out of legal caution, not out of strategic calculation, but because they were the last real communication she had offered him, and he was not willing to make them into lies by acting against them. But there was a difference between finding her and reaching her. He did not want her location. He needed her to know that something was developing that she deserved to be informed about. He called Elena. The phone went to voicemail on the first ring as it had the night before, as it would continue to do until Elena decided otherwise. He left a message this time. He kept it short. He said, "Elena, I'm not calling about finding Sophie. I'm calling because there's a reporter developing a story that is going to connect to Sophie's name, and she deserves to know before it breaks. That's all. Please tell her." He paused. "Please tell her I'm not trying to reach her for any other reason. I just need her to know." He hung up. Across town in a coffee shop on 53rd Street that had the particular quality of a place chosen deliberately for its anonymity, Natalie Brooks sat across from her own attorney, a woman she had called that morning in a state of controlled panic that she had worked very hard to manage into something resembling calm. The attorney's name was Patricia Osei, and she had the manner of someone who had heard everything twice and was therefore unsurprisable. She listened to Natalie's account without interrupting, made notes in small, precise handwriting, and when Natalie finished, she asked only one question. "Did you ever have any reason to believe the professional arrangement and the personal arrangement were connected? Did he ever suggest that one was contingent on the other?" Natalie thought about it carefully, about the first dinner, about the way the professional and personal had blurred gradually, not in one dramatic moment, but in a slow dissolve, each conversation drifting slightly further from the boardroom, until suddenly they were somewhere entirely different, without her having made a single explicit choice to go there. Not explicitly, she said, but looking back. The consulting contract came through about 3 weeks after we started, after things became personal. I told myself the timing was coincidental. Tu saw me seeing me TSM. Patricia nodded. She wrote something down. Here is where you stand, she said. If the professional relationship was legitimate, and from what you've described, there's a strong case that your work product was entirely sound, then you have significant protection. The question is whether anyone can argue that the contract itself was improperly awarded. A pause. My advice is this: do not speak to any reporters. Do not reach out to Sebastian Hale in any capacity. And send me every document related to your work on this project by end of business today. Natalie nodded. Her hands were in her lap, still the way she held them when she was keeping herself from showing how unsteady she felt. Can I ask you something? She said. Of course. Sophie Hale. She said the name carefully, like she was handling something sharp. Do you know if she's... I don't know anything about Mrs. Hale's situation, Patricia said. And honestly, Natalie, I would strongly advise you to keep it that way. Natalie nodded again. She looked down at the table. She thought about the profile she had read the night before the photograph, the direct gaze, the description of a woman who was precise and fearless. She had spent 3 months trying not to think about Sophie Hale as a full human being, because thinking about her that way made everything else impossible to justify. Now she could not stop. She thought that woman built a life with him for 11 years. She thought that woman is carrying his child. She thought that woman knew probably for longer than I realized, and she did not collapse, and she did not react badly, and she simply left with precision, and I am sitting here in a coffee shop with a lawyer because of choices I made that I cannot take back. She did not cry. She had done enough of that in the last 24 hours. Instead, she picked up her phone, opened her email, and began forwarding documents to Patricia Ose. It was the only useful thing she could do. So she did it. At 4:15, Elena Vasquez listened to Sebastian's voicemail 3 times. Then she walked down the hall of her apartment to the guest room and knocked lightly on the open door. Sophie was sitting up against the headboard reading something on her laptop, her feet tucked under her. Audrey visibly active, a ripple of movement across the fabric of her shirt. She looked up when Elena came in. Sebastian called, Elena said. She did not soften it. Sophie had never asked her to soften things. He left a voicemail. He says there's a reporter developing a story that's going to include your name. He says he's not trying to find you. He says he just wanted you to know. Sophie's expression did not change dramatically. There was a stillness to it, the particular stillness of someone who has already run several scenarios in their head and is now simply identifying which one has arrived. What kind of reporter? She said. Elena sat down on the edge of the bed. Financial. He's been asking questions about the restructuring deal, about Natalie Brooks's involvement. She paused. He's also apparently been asking whether you've been seen recently. Sophie looked out the window for a moment. Then she said, he's going to connect the personal story to the professional story. That's Sebastian's assessment, yes. He's right. She closed the laptop. She pressed her lips together briefly, not in distress, but in the way of someone lining up a decision. Okay, here's what we do. I'm not hiding. I never planned to hide indefinitely. I left to get clear, not to disappear. She looked at Elena directly. I want you to reach out to Sebastian's counsel tomorrow morning before the end of business. I want my terms on the table before this reporter makes any more calls. Because if the story breaks while we're still in silence, it looks like collapse. And I am not a collapsed woman. Samai. Elena looked at her friend for a long moment. Then she said, you know that's going to start a process that doesn't stop. Good, Sophie said. I'm ready for it to not stop. She placed one hand on her belly. Audrey moved underneath it, immediate, as if punctuating the statement. We both are. Elena nodded. She stood up. She was almost to the door when Sophie said quietly, Elena. She turned back. He said, don't tell him where I am. He said he didn't want to know. Sophie was quiet for a moment. Something moved across her face, not forgiveness, not warmth, but something more complicated than either. The recognition, perhaps, of a man who was finally too late trying to do one thing correctly. "Okay," she said. She opened her laptop again. "Tomorrow morning, make the call." In the penthouse, Sebastian was standing in the nursery doorway for the second night in a row. He had not planned to end up there. He had simply walked through the apartment and found himself again in the doorway of the yellow room. The mobile turned in the heated air. He stood there and thought about Audrey, the name he had suggested in a moment of pure, unperformed happiness, the one time in recent memory when he had been entirely genuine. He was going to be a father. That had not changed. Whatever else had collapsed, whatever else he had broken or lost or handed away through his own choices that remained, a daughter was coming, and what she would know of him, what she would grow up understanding about who her father was, that was still being written. It was the only story he had any possibility of influencing now. He stepped back from the doorway. He went to the kitchen. He poured the scotch he'd been pouring for 2 days down the sink. He put the glass in the dishwasher. He sat down at the kitchen island with a glass of water and his phone, and he opened the notes application, and he started writing. Not to Sophie, not to anyone, just to himself, the things he needed to say when the time came. Not the negotiation, not the strategy, just the truth, plain and unmanaged, the way Sophie had always deserved to receive it. He wrote for a long time. Outside Manhattan did what it always did. And in Vermont, Sophie slept finally and deeply, with her hand on her daughter, in a quiet room far from everything she was leaving behind and everything she was moving toward. Neither of them knew yet exactly what the morning would bring, but Sophie had a plan. She had always had a plan. And somewhere in Sebastian Hale, underneath the architect of deals and the man who had smiled across the breakfast table with practiced ease, something was finally painfully beginning to crack open into honesty. Elena made the call at 8:53 on Thursday morning. Sebastian's attorney was a man named Carter Webb, 58, silver-haired, one of the most respected family law practitioners in New York, a man whose name on a retainer agreement signaled that the person who hired him was serious about protecting what they had. Sebastian had retained him Wednesday evening, which meant Sebastian had moved faster than Sophie expected, which meant Sebastian was more afraid than he was letting on. Elena registered this without surprise. She had been doing this long enough to know that the speed at which someone lawyers up is in direct proportion to how much they have to lose. Carter picked up on the second ring. "Elena," he said with the particular warmth of two professionals who have faced each other across enough conference tables to have developed a mutual respect that exists entirely separately from whose side they are on. "I was expecting your call." "Then we're both prepared," Elena said. "Good. Let's skip the pleasantries and talk about what my client wants." A brief pause. "Go ahead." Sophie is not interested in a prolonged negotiation. She is not interested in mediation theater. She wants clean, documented, and final. Primary physical custody of Audrey with a structured visitation arrangement to be determined based on Sebastian's demonstrated behavior over the next 6 months. Full activation of the conduct clause in the prenuptial agreement. The penthouse, she doesn't want it. She wants the Berkshire property, the trust account established in her name in 2019, and her full independent asset portfolio untouched. Elena paused to let that land. In exchange, she is prepared to handle this privately. No public statements from her side. No cooperation with any journalists pursuing related stories. Carter was quiet for exactly 5 seconds. Elena had counted his silences before. 5 seconds meant he was processing, not stalling. "The conduct clause activation will require documented evidence," he said. "Presumably she has it." "She has a great deal of it." Another 5 seconds. "The visitation structure," she said, "based on demonstrated behavior." "What does that mean specifically?" "It means Sebastian does not walk in as a co-equal parent on day one. He earns access. He demonstrates over a defined period that he is capable of being the kind of father Audrey deserves. Sophie is not removing him from his daughter's life. She is requiring him to show up for it correctly." Carter said, "He's going to want to see her." "He can want many things," Elena said. "Right now what he gets is the terms." There was a longer pause. Then Carter said quietly, not as an attorney, but as a man who had clearly spoken with his client and had some sense of what was happening on the other side of this, "Elena, he's not fighting this." Elena let that sit for a moment. "I know," she said. "Tell him the terms are on his desk by noon." She hung up. She walked back to the kitchen where Sophie was eating breakfast. Actual breakfast eggs and toast, the same methodical self-care she had been practicing since arriving in Vermont, as if feeding herself properly was itself a form of resistance. She looked up when Elena came in, and Elena said, "Carter Webb, he's not fighting it." Sophie put her fork down. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Good." Just that. One word flat and final, the way you say a word when it contains an entire year of exhaustion. Kara, pouring coffee at the counter, said nothing. She simply refilled Sophie's mug and put it back within reach. That was all. By 10:30 that same morning, the story broke. Not the full story, not yet, but enough. The financial column published a piece at 10:22 that described irregularities in the consulting arrangements on Sebastian's restructuring deal named Natalie Brooks, as the consultant in question noted her sudden withdrawal from the project and included a carefully worded line at the end that said, "Sources close to the situation describe the arrangement as having both professional and personal dimensions." The reporter did not name Sophie. He did not need to. Anyone who knew the situation could read between the lines with both eyes closed. Diane Foster called Sebastian at 10:31. He was already at his desk reading the piece on his laptop when the phone rang. "It's out," she said. "I'm reading it. It's careful. He's leaving room for a follow-up." A beat. "Sebastian, I need to know right now, is there anything in your personal life that is going to become the follow-up? Because if there is, I need to know it before he publishes it, not after." Sebastian leaned back in his chair. He looked at the ceiling of his office, the same ceiling he had stared at the day before, the same ceiling that offered no answers. "Sophie left me," he said. "The reporter has already noticed her absence. If he connects those two things, and he will if someone gives him the right nudge, then yes, there is a follow-up." Diane was silent for 3 full seconds, which was longer than usual. Then, "Okay, then we get ahead of it. Today, this afternoon." "How?" "You give a statement. Short, dignified, controlled. You confirm the marriage is going through a difficult period. You do not mention infidelity. You do not mention Natalie. You do not use the word separation. You say something human, something that makes you a person having a hard time rather than a powerful man hiding something. And then we close the door on it before he can open it wider." Sebastian thought about Sophie in Vermont. Sophie, who had said handle this privately. Sophie, who had offered as part of her terms through Elena not to cooperate with journalists. He thought about what it would mean to issue a statement without telling her first. He thought about whether he had the right to make that decision unilaterally. Then he thought about whether he had the right to make any decision unilaterally anymore about anything that touched her life. "Give me an hour," he said. "You have 40 minutes. He called Carter Webb the moment he hung up with Diane. "I need you to reach Elena Vasquez," he said. "Tell her I'm about to issue a short public statement about the marriage. Nothing specific, nothing damaging, nothing that contradicts Sophie's terms. But I need her to know before it goes out. I'm not going to blindside her." Carter was quiet for a moment. "That's actually a reasonable gesture." "It's not a gesture," Sebastian said more sharply than he intended. Then quieter, "It's just the right thing to do. Tell Elena." Carter told Elena. Elena called Sophie. Sophie listened to the proposed statement. Carter read it to Elena. Elena read it to Sophie. A chain of communication assembled specifically to keep Sophie informed without requiring her to speak to Sebastian directly, and she was quiet for a moment after she heard it. "It's fine," she said. "It doesn't say anything false. Let him release it." Elena relayed the approval. Carter relayed it to Sebastian. The statement went out at 11:58, 4 minutes before Diane's deadline. It was 63 words long. It said that Sebastian and Sophie Hale were navigating a difficult period in their marriage, that Sophie's well-being and the well-being of their daughter remained his primary concern, and that he asked for privacy during this time. It said nothing else. The reporter published his follow-up at 2:15, and the statement had done exactly what Diane intended it to do. It transformed the story from a scandal in progress to a human situation in resolution. The follow-up referenced the statement. It noted Sophie's absence from public life. It connected the professional and personal elements gently, carefully, in the way of a reporter who has found something real but does not yet have all the pieces. It was not nothing, but it was manageable. By 3 o'clock, Diane called it contained. "For now," she said, "he'll keep digging, but the immediate damage is limited." Sebastian hung up and sat in his office in the quiet of mid-afternoon and felt something he had not expected to feel, not relief, not victory, but a strange, specific gratitude toward Sophie that had nothing to do with strategy. She had told Elena to let him release the statement. She could have said no. She could have let him flounder publicly while she stayed silent in Vermont, and no one would have blamed her. She had chosen instead to let him preserve a small piece of his dignity. Not because she owed it to him, because she had decided in her own calculus that it was the right thing. He sat with that for a while. At 4 o'clock, Jonathan Park came in and closed the door behind him again. "The Whitmore call," he said. "Gerald Whitmore wants to reconvene." He read the statement. And he says, and I want to quote him, precisely he says, the man put his wife's name first, before the business, before the deal. He noticed that. Sebastian looked at Jonathan. "The statement listed Sophie's well-being as the primary concern," he said. "I know what it said. I'm telling you what Gerald noticed." Jonathan sat down. "He's not pulling out of the deal. He wants to accelerate the Singapore timeline. He wants this closed before any further press attention, which means he needs you focused and functional, not managing a personal collapse." "I'm functional." "You've slept approximately 4 hours in the last 48, Jonathan said without inflection. "You've lost weight since Monday, which is physiologically impressive for 2 days. And you've been staring at your office door every time someone walks past it, like you're waiting for someone to come through who isn't going to." He paused. "You're functional. You're also falling apart. Both things can be true." Sebastian looked at him for a long moment. "Jonathan, have you ever done something, really done it knowingly, with enough awareness to know it was wrong, and then had it cost you exactly what you knew it would cost you, and still been surprised by how much it hurt?" Jonathan was quiet for a moment. "Once," he said. "A long time ago." "What did you do?" "I did the work," Jonathan said simply. "There wasn't anything else to do. The rest, the feeling part, you just carry it and keep moving." He stood up. "Singapore call is tomorrow at 7 a.m. I need you ready." Sebastian nodded. Jonathan left, and Sebastian turned to his computer and opened the notes application, the one he had been writing in since Tuesday night, the one that no one would ever read except possibly himself, and he read what he had written, not edited it, not refined it, just read it the way you read something painful, to remind yourself that you are capable of telling the truth to yourself even when you have spent months lying to everyone else. He closed it. He picked up his phone. He opened his contacts. He found Sophie's name. He stared at it for a long time. He did not call. He did not text. He had told her not to look for her, and he had meant it, and reaching out on impulse because he was sitting in his office feeling the full weight of his own choices was not a reason to break that. The one thing he could do, the only thing left that was fully in his control, was not make it worse. So he put the phone down, and he went back to work. In Vermont, Sophie did not spend the afternoon watching news coverage. She asked Kara to tell her when it was over, and then she went for a slow walk. Slow, because her back had been aching for 2 days. Slow, because she was 38 and 7 months along, and her body had opinions about the pace at which it wanted to move. And she walked along the quiet road behind Kara's property and breathed cold air and thought about nothing in particular, which was, she realized, the first time in months she had been able to think about nothing in particular. The relentless calculation, the documenting, the planning, the legal strategy, the careful management of her exit had taken up so much space in her mind that she had forgotten what it felt like to just walk somewhere and be in her body. Audrey was active in the afternoons. She had been active in the afternoons since around month 5, a pattern Sophie had tracked with the same attention she brought to everything, not out of anxiety, but out of genuine fascination. She pressed one hand to her side as she walked and felt her daughter moving with the rhythm of her steps, and she thought, you have no idea what's happened this week. You have no idea what any of it means. You just exist completely in the fact of yourself. She wanted to give her daughter that, not the sheltered ignorance of it. Audrey would grow up knowing things, understanding things, asking hard questions that deserved honest answers. But the capacity for it, the ability to simply be present in one's own existence without needing it managed or controlled or constructed into something more palatable than it was. That was what Sophie was reaching toward. That was what the penthouse had been slowly, quietly removing from her for years, not through any single dramatic deprivation, but through the accumulated weight of a life that was more curated than lived. She was done curating. She turned around at the end of the road and walked back, and the cold air was sharp and clean, and her daughter was moving, and somewhere behind her, the city and the statement and the reporters and Carter Webb and all the machinery of consequence was running without her, and she let it run. At 7:45 that evening, Kara sat down across from Sophie at the kitchen table and said, "Okay, are you going to tell me the whole thing? Because I've given you 3 days and I've been very patient, and I would like to understand what I'm watching you go through." Sophie looked at her. Then she laughed that same rough, unused laugh from the first evening, but warmer now, more like itself. "You've been very patient," she agreed. "I have. It's been physically painful." Sophie wrapped both hands around her mug, and then she talked. Not the documentary version, not the documented timeline of evidence and legal strategy, not the structured account she had given Elena. The real version. The one that started not with Natalie's name, but with the morning she had first woken up next to Sebastian and felt not unhappy exactly, but reduced. Like a woman who had spent so long fitting herself into the shape of someone else's life that she had forgotten she had her own shape. She talked about the carbonara dinner the night before she left the performance of it, the ache of it, the way she had looked at the man across the table and grieved not what he had done, but what they had been before he had chosen to do it. She talked about packing the duffel bag at Elena's office 2 weeks before she used it. She talked about Audrey's name, about sitting in that hospital room and hearing Sebastian say it, and knowing it was right, and knowing in the same moment that she would name her daughter after a woman who had been graceful and resilient and entirely herself. Kara listened without interrupting until Sophie was done. Then she said, "He doesn't deserve you." "I know," Sophie said. "I knew that before I found out about Natalie. That's the part that actually took me longest to admit." Kara nodded. "And Audrey," Sophie looked down at her mug. "He loves her. I believe that the loving her part, that part I think is real." A pause. "He just forgot for a while that loving someone and being trustworthy are not the same thing." "Are you going to let him be her father?" "Yes." No hesitation. "But on terms that make sense, not because he's entitled to it, because she deserves to know her father, the real one, the one who suggested her name and cried at the ultrasound, not the one who thought he could manage everyone around him like a portfolio." She looked up. "If he can find his way back to being that person, we'll see." Kara was quiet for a moment. Then, "What about you? Not the attorney, not the plan, not the strategy. You, Sophie. What do you want?" Sophie thought about it. Really thought. Not the practiced answer, not the framing she had used with Elena or with herself in the mirror. What she actually wanted underneath all of it. "I want to make something again," she said finally. "A real project, something that matters. I had an idea before everything fell apart about a documentary on women who rebuild. Not survivors, not victims, women who simply redesign their lives from the inside out." She paused. "I think I might be living the research." Kara looked at her for a long moment. Then she smiled the wide, real smile of a woman who has known someone through every version of themselves and is watching a version she particularly likes emerge. That, she said, is going to be extraordinary. The next morning, Friday, Sebastian was on the Singapore call at 7 a.m. as Jonathan had required. He was present. He was precise. He walked the Singaporean partners through the revised timeline with the particular focused competence that had built his career, the part of him that ran clean and uncontaminated by personal chaos, the part that had always been real, even when other parts of him were not. At 9:15, Carter Webb called. Elena's received the formal terms document, he said. She's reviewed it with Sophie. Sophie has 2 amendments, minor ones, and then she's prepared to sign. Sebastian's heart did something complicated in his chest. Not relief, exactly. More like the feeling of a door closing. Not slamming, not crashing, but closing quietly with finality. The sound of something real ending. "What are the amendments?" Carter told him. They were small a clarification on the Berkshire property boundaries, and a specific addition to the visitation language that required a neutral mediator present at all initial meetings between Sebastian and Audrey. Not unreasonable, not punitive, just precise. Just Sophie. "Accept both," Sebastian said immediately. "You don't want to review them. I don't need to review them. Accept them." Carter paused. "Okay." "Carter." Sebastian's voice had something in it. Not the business voice, not the public voice, but the voice from the kitchen island on Tuesday morning, the one doing its best. Do you have any sense of how she is? Not location, not details, just is she okay? Carter was quiet for a moment. He was an attorney, not a messenger, but he was also underneath the professional armoring a person. "From everything I understand," he said carefully, "she is doing well. She has good people around her." "Good," Sebastian said. He let out a breath. "That's good." After the call, he sat alone again in his office. He thought about the notes application on his phone, the honest, unmanaged thing he had been writing since Tuesday night, the thing he had never shown anyone. He picked up his phone. He opened the app. He read the last line he had written. "The only thing I can do now that actually matters is show her over time who I choose to be. Not who I have been, who I choose to be." He had written that at 2 a.m. 3 nights ago, alone in the penthouse. Reading it in daylight in his office, surrounded by the evidence of the professional life that was against all odds, still standing, it did not sound like desperation anymore. It sounded like the beginning of something. Not forgiveness, not reconciliation, just the first honest direction he had pointed himself in a very long time. He put the phone away. He opened the Singapore file. He went to work. And in Vermont, Sophie Hale, who had walked out of her life 6 days ago with 1 duffel bag and 4 lines on a piece of paper and a daughter 7 months from being born, was sitting at Kara's kitchen table with her laptop open, and she was writing. Not legal documents, not evidence files, the opening pages of something new. She wrote for 3 hours without stopping. She did not know yet if it was good. She only knew that it was hers entirely, completely without negotiation or curation or the constant low-level awareness of how it would look to someone else. It was hers, the way her daughter was hers, the way the life she was now building brick by careful brick in the cold clarity of a Vermont winter was hers. Outside, the sky was doing something dramatic with clouds and cold light, but Sophie was not looking at it. She was looking at the screen. She was working. She was in every way that counted completely and entirely herself. And in the penthouse on the 34th floor in the yellow nursery, with the mobile turning slowly in the heated air, a room full of small, careful things, folded blankets, tiny shoes, and early morning color on the walls, waited for the person it had been built for. A person who was not yet born and who would arrive into a world that was already different from the one her parents had imagined when they chose her name, but who would be loved fiercely, imperfectly, honestly by both of them. That was not nothing. In fact, in all the wreckage and reckoning and quiet rebuilding of these extraordinary 6 days, it might have been the only thing that was entirely uncomplicatedly true. The contractions started on a Wednesday morning 3 weeks earlier than expected. Sophie woke at 4:47 with the particular quality of pain that does not ask permission, not sharp, not dramatic, but deep and serious and impossible to argue with. She lay still for 30 seconds timing. Then she sat up, reached for her phone, and called Kara's name through the wall without raising her voice the way you call for someone when you need them to come quickly, but you do not want to frighten anyone, including yourself. Kara was in the doorway in 11 seconds. She took one look at Sophie's face and said, Now, Sophie said. Call Dr. Reeves. Dr. Margaret Reeves was the obstetrician Kara had found through the hospital in Burlington, 61 years old, 33 years of practice, the kind of doctor who had the manner of someone who has seen every possible variation of human arrival into the world and was therefore unshakable in the best possible way. She had met with Sophie twice since Sophie arrived in Vermont, reviewed her full prenatal records from the New York practice, and said, with the directness Sophie had immediately trusted, "You're healthy, the baby is healthy, and 3 weeks early is entirely manageable. If something starts, call me first, then call the hospital." Kara called Dr. Reeves. Dr. Reeves said she would meet them at the hospital. Kara drove. Sophie sat in the passenger seat with one hand on the door and one hand on her belly and breathed through each contraction with the same focused, deliberate attention she had brought to every hard thing in the last month. She did not panic. She did not cry. She simply moved through it one breath at a time, which was all labor has ever asked of anyone. At the hospital, the intake nurse asked for emergency contact information. Sophie gave Elena's name and number. The nurse looked up. "No partner." "No," Sophie said, quietly without explanation. The nurse moved on without comment. 12 hours and 41 minutes after the first contraction, Audrey Rose Hale arrived. She was 6 pounds and 2 ounces. She was, according to Dr. Reeves, in perfect health. She had Sophie's dark eyes immediately, obviously, before Sophie had even properly caught her breath. And when the nurse placed her on Sophie's chest, Audrey did not cry for long. She simply stopped, the way certain people stop when they find themselves somewhere they recognize, and she looked up at Sophie with the ancient, unfocused gaze of the newly arrived, and Sophie looked back at her daughter for the first time and said in a voice that was nothing like her documentary voice, nothing like her attorney meeting voice, nothing like any voice she had used in a very long time. "Hi, it's you. I've been waiting to meet you." "Hi, Asa system." Kara was in the corner of the room. She was crying. She did not apologize for it. Elena got the call at 7:19 in the evening. She was in her office, still at her desk, and when Kara's name came up on her phone, she felt her chest tighten with the particular anticipation of news that is either very good or very complicated. She picked up on the first ring. "She's here," Kara said. "Both of them are perfect." Elena put her hand over her mouth. She sat like that for a moment. Then she said, "Tell Sophie I'll be there tomorrow morning." "She said to tell you not to rush." She said, and I'm quoting, she said, "Tell Elena I have everything I need tonight." Elena laughed, which came out wrong, which meant she was also crying slightly. "Of course she did," she said. "Of course." She hung up. She sat in her office for a long moment. Then she picked up her phone again and sent a text to Carter Webb. It said, "Only Audrey Rose Hale. Born this evening, mother and daughter both well." She hesitated for exactly 3 seconds before sending it. Then she sent it because Sebastian deserved to know. Not from a reporter, not from a public announcement, but from the chain of people who were handling this situation with as much decency as the situation allowed. Carter Webb received the text at 7:24. He was at home at his kitchen table reading through a contract that had nothing to do with Sebastian Hale. He read the message twice. Then he called Sebastian. Sebastian was in the penthouse. He had been in the penthouse every evening that week, not because he lacked the option of going elsewhere, but because leaving felt somehow wrong, like abandoning a post, though he could not have said precisely what he was guarding. He had been eating properly, sleeping marginally better, working at a functional level. He had, as Jonathan had instructed, kept his face composed in every professional context. He had not fallen apart publicly. He was holding. His phone rang at 7:26. Carter's name on the screen. He picked up immediately. "Audrey Rose Hale," Carter said. "Born this evening. Sophie and the baby are both well." Sebastian sat down. He had not realized he was standing until suddenly he was not. He sat on the edge of the couch in the living room where he and Sophie had watched movies where she had fallen asleep with her head on his shoulder more times than he could count, and he held the phone against his ear and did not say anything for a moment. "Sebastian, I'm here," he said. His voice was rough. He cleared it. They're both healthy, both well. That's all I know." He nodded, which was useless, since Carter could not see him. "Okay," he said. "Okay." He pressed the heel of his hand to his eye for a moment. "Thank you for calling me." "Of course." After Carter hung up, Sebastian sat on the couch for a long time. He thought about the name Audrey Rose. He had suggested Audrey. He did not know where the Rose had come from. He imagined Sophie lying in a hospital room in Vermont, their daughter on her chest choosing the middle name alone, and he thought, of course she chose Rose. She had always loved the pragmatism of roses, beautiful and thorned in equal measure, nothing decorative about the defense. He picked up his phone and opened the notes application. He added one line at the bottom of everything he had written: "She's here. She's real. Now earn it." Now. He closed the app. He stood up. He walked to the nursery for what felt like the 100th time in the past 2 weeks, and this time it felt different. Not empty in the way it had felt empty since Tuesday. Different. Charged somehow. Like a room that has been waiting for the right person to arrive, and now knows that the wait has a specific measurable end. He turned off the nursery light. He went to bed. And for the first time since Sophie left, he slept without waking. 3 days later, Sophie came home from the hospital, not to the penthouse, not to Manhattan, but to Kara's house, which had become in the most organic and unplanned way the right place. Elena arrived Thursday morning as promised. She sat in the guest room with Sophie and Audrey and a cup of tea and a legal pad, and they went through the final signed agreement in its complete form. Sophie had already reviewed it 3 times. She reviewed it once more, with Elena walking her through each section because that was who Sophie was. She did not skip steps. She did not assume she verified. "It's clean," Elena said when they finished. "It's everything we asked for." Sophie looked at the signature page. Sebastian's signature was there, not a rushed scrawl, but a deliberate, careful version of his name, the way he signed things when he was paying attention. She recognized the difference. She had watched him sign 1,000 documents. "He didn't push back on anything," she said, "not a single item." She thought about that, not warmly, not with the soft, nostalgic ache of someone revisiting what was, but with the measured, clear-eyed acknowledgement of someone taking an accurate reading. He had accepted every term, including the mediator requirement, including the 6-month demonstrated behavior period, including the conduct clause activation that would be part of the permanent record. He had not asked for anything in return except one item through Carter, a request, not a demand, that when the time was right, when Sophie decided the time was right, he be allowed to meet Audrey, not to come to the house, not to have access to Sophie, just to meet his daughter. "What do you want to do about his request?" Elena asked carefully. Sophie looked at Audrey asleep in the portable bassinet beside the bed. She had been studying her daughter's face with the intensity of someone learning a new language. She had catalogued her own dark eyes, her own nose, her own ears, and also, undeniably, Sebastian's jaw, the exact line of it already visible in this 6-pound person who had been in the world for 3 days. Biology was not subtle. "Tell Carter I'll be in touch when I'm ready," she said. "Not a timeline, just when I'm ready." Elena nodded. She made a note. "And Sophie, for what it's worth as your attorney and your friend, I think what you've done here is remarkable. You came into this situation with everything stacked against you. 7 months pregnant evidence of betrayal, a man with significant legal resources, and you walked out with every material thing you asked for your daughter's future protected, and your name still entirely your own." Sophie was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I had good help." "You had good instincts," Elena said. "I just wrote them down legally." 6 weeks passed. Sophie did not measure them the way she had measured the weeks before she left by patterns and evidence and strategic timing. She measured them in Audrey. First smile, or the thing that looked like a smile which the internet insisted was gas, but which Sophie chose to interpret as a smile on the grounds that she had earned the right to decide. First time Audrey grabbed her finger and held on that reflexive grip that is one of the oldest things a human being does. Older than language or choice or awareness, just the pure animal certainty that holding on is the right move. First night, when Sophie slept 3 consecutive hours and woke feeling for the first time in longer than she could calculate like a person, rather than a system of managed responses. She also worked, not heavily, not at full capacity. Her body had produced a human being 6 weeks ago and had opinions about being pushed too hard. But the documentary idea she had started writing at Kara's kitchen table had grown into something real. She had pages. She had a structural outline. She had called tentatively an old producing partner named David Kim, who had worked with her on the Peabody-nominated piece and who she trusted completely. And she had described the project without naming herself as a subject, and David had said, "Sophie, that's the best idea you've had in 5 years. When do we start?" 6 months, she had said. "I'll hold the development slot." Life was building itself back. Not into the shape it had been, that shape was finished, and she had no nostalgia for its particulars, only sometimes for the feeling of certainty it had once given her, which she was learning to generate internally rather than importing from external sources. That was the work. That was always the work. On a Tuesday morning, exactly 8 weeks after the Tuesday she had left, her phone rang with Carter Webb's name on the screen. She answered. "Carter." "I'm sorry to call directly," he said. "I wanted to go through Elena, but she's in court this morning, and I have a time-sensitive situation." A pause. "Sebastian has asked me to let you know again, not as a demand, just as information, that he has completed the first of the agreed behavioral benchmarks. He's been attending therapy weekly for 6 consecutive weeks, as required by the mediation terms. Dr. Anara Patel, the mediator you both approved, has confirmed it." Sophie processed this. She had not expected the first benchmark this fast. She had half assumed Sebastian would treat the behavioral requirements the way he treated most things that were not business, competently, efficiently, and with one eye on the minimum required to check a box. 6 consecutive weeks of therapy was not the minimum. The minimum was 4. "He's done 6, she said. "Dr. Patel says 7. He started before the agreement was signed." Sophie looked at Audrey, awake now in her bouncer, doing the thing she had recently started doing, where she tracked movement with her eyes, following Sophie's hand, following the light, following the mobile that Sophie had brought from the penthouse because it was beautiful, and Audrey deserved beautiful things, regardless of their origin. "Tell Carter thank you for the information," she said. "Tell him I'll be in touch." She put the phone down. She picked Audrey up that warm, specific weight that she was still 8 weeks and not entirely accustomed to, still slightly stunned by, every time the fact of this person in her arms, and she sat in the chair by the window and held her daughter and thought. She thought about Sebastian at 29, the first time she had met him at a dinner party in Brooklyn, hosted by a mutual friend, before either of them had any idea the evening was going to matter. He had been standing near the window. She remembered this clearly. The detail had stayed for reasons she had never fully analyzed, and he had been arguing with the kind of passion that surprises you in a person you have just met about the ethics of documentary filmmaking. Not attacking her work. He did not know her work yet. Just genuinely engaged with the question of what it means to tell someone else's story and whether the truth ever fully compensates for the exposure. She had argued back hard, and he had listened with the quality of attention that would become both his most attractive feature and later the thing she most missed when it was directed elsewhere. She thought about him reading the note on the bed. She thought about the voicemail he had left for Elena, the one where he said, "I just need her to know," not as manipulation, just as information. She thought about the statement he had released, 63 words, her name first. She thought about him accepting every single term without a counteroffer. She was not forgiving him. She wanted to be very clear with herself about that. Forgiveness was a different process, a longer one that she was not going to rush or perform for anyone's comfort, including her own. But there was a difference between forgiveness and recognition, and she recognized she could not honestly avoid recognizing that the man who had spent the last 8 weeks doing the work quietly, without audience, without leverage, without any guarantee that it would change anything, was trying to become someone different. Whether he would get there was not something she could know yet. Whether the trying was real was not something she could know yet. But it was not nothing. She kissed the top of Audrey's head. She smelled that specific, impossible smell of her daughter's hair, the one that no one had ever successfully described in words, the one that made every complicated thing in her life temporarily smaller. "Your father," she said quietly into the small, warm space between them, "is trying. We don't know yet if trying is going to be enough, but it's more than he was doing before." Audrey looked at her with those dark eyes that were both entirely hers and entirely Sebastian's, and entirely incomprehensibly a new person's. Sophie sat with that for a while. Then she called Elena. "I want to schedule the first mediated meeting," she said when Elena picked up. Between Sebastian and Audrey. Not between Sebastian and me. I will not be in the room. Dr. Patel facilitates. You observe. He comes to a neutral location. He gets 45 minutes. That's all. A brief silence. Are you sure? I'm not sure of anything, Sophie said honestly. But Audrey is 8 weeks old, and she has a father who is trying, and I am not going to let my anger, as justified as it is, prevent her from having access to a relationship that could matter to her. Her voice was steady, clear, the voice of a woman who has thought about something long and hard enough that the emotion has passed through and left only clarity in its place. Set it up for 2 weeks from now. Give him enough time to prepare. Okay, Elena said. I'll call Carter. Elena, a pause. Don't tell him I'm doing this because he earned it. Tell him I'm doing this because Audrey deserves it. Those are different things, and I need him to understand the difference. Elena was quiet for a moment. You know, she said, you are one of the most precise people I have ever known in my life. I make documentaries, Sophie said. Precision is professional. She hung up. She put Audrey back in the bouncer. She opened her laptop and went back to her pages. The outline, the structure, the opening section she had now rewritten 4 times in the ongoing pursuit of the sentence that was true and sharp and exactly right. She wrote for an hour. She made herself lunch. She fed Audrey. She called her mother, who had known something was wrong for weeks and had been waiting with the enormous patience of a woman who has raised Sophie long enough to know that pushing produces nothing but resistance for Sophie to be ready to tell her. She told her now, all of it. Her mother listened without interrupting, which was its own form of love, and at the end said only, Are you okay? I'm going to be, Sophie said. That's different from okay, but it's enough. It was the same thing she had said to Elena 8 weeks ago in that battered leather chair. She meant it more now than she had then, because then it had been a direction, and now it was beginning to be a destination. 2 weeks later, on a Thursday afternoon in a neutral conference room at Dr. Patel's office in Burlington, a room with no particular emotional weight, chosen precisely because it belonged to neither of them. Sebastian Hale met his daughter for the first time. Sophie was not there. She had dropped Audrey with Elena in the waiting area and left the building before Sebastian arrived because she was not ready to see him, and she was not going to force herself to be ready for anyone's sake but her own. Elena carried Audrey into the room. Dr. Patel was present. Carter Webb sat in the corner with a legal pad he never opened. Sebastian was already there when they came in. He was sitting in one of the chairs, not at the table, but beside it, as if he had not wanted to create any impression of formality or control. He was wearing a plain, dark sweater, no tie, no performance of success. He looked, Elena thought, like a man who had taken everything off and arrived as just himself, which was either very brave or the most strategic thing he had ever done, and possibly both. He looked up when they came in. He saw Audrey. And his face did something that Elena, who had watched people at their most unguarded for 20 years of family law practice, could not find a category for. It was not the face of a man checking a box. It was not even the face of a man experiencing a planned emotional moment. It was the face of a person encountering something that was simply too real to manage, too specific, too immediate, too alive. His jaw tightened. He pressed his lips together for a moment. He stood up slowly. He looked at Elena, who nodded once. Then he crossed the room carefully, the way you cross a room when you are trying not to move too fast or too slow, or in any way that might disturb something fragile. Elena placed Audrey in his arms. He held his daughter. He looked at her face, the dark eyes, the jaw that was his jaw, the utter newness and completeness of this 10-week-old person who had no framework yet for who he was or what he had done or what any of it meant, who only knew the warmth of being held and the sound of a heartbeat. He held her, and he was absolutely still. His eyes were wet. He did not blink for a long moment, as if blinking would interrupt something. He said very quietly, "Hi, Audrey." Dr. Patel made a note on her pad. Carter Webb looked at the wall. Elena looked at Sebastian holding his daughter and felt something settle in her chest that she would not have been able to name precisely, but that was adjacent to the recognition that some situations, despite everything, contain the possibility of becoming something other than what they are. 45 minutes later, Elena carried Audrey back through the waiting room to where Sophie was sitting with a coffee she had not drunk, scrolling through her phone, with the focused non-attention of someone who is actually doing nothing except waiting. She looked up when Elena came in. She looked at her daughter first, the specific immediate scanning that parents do, checking without thinking, registering okay, before anything else. Then she looked at Elena. "How did he do?" she asked. Elena sat down beside her. She thought about what she had seen in that room, the stillness of it, the reality of it, the thing on Sebastian's face that she did not have a category for. Then she said, "He was good. He was really good, Sophie." Sophie nodded. She took Audrey back. She settled her daughter against her chest with the practiced ease of 10 weeks of practice. She was quiet for a moment, and Elena watched her process it, not with softness, not with the warm collapse of someone being won back, but with the careful, honest acknowledgement of someone taking an accurate reading. "Good?" Sophie said finally. "That's good." She stood up. She put her coat on with one hand, Audrey held against her with the other. The particular one-handed choreography of new motherhood that she had only recently stopped being surprised by her own ability to execute. She looked at Elena. "Same time in 4 weeks. I'll set it up." Sophie nodded. She walked through the door. Outside, the Vermont afternoon was cold and clear, and she walked to her car and strapped Audrey into the seat with the same deliberate attention she brought to everything that mattered, and she got in and sat for a moment before starting the engine. She thought about the morning she had left the penthouse, the note on the bed, the elevator doors closing, the car moving uptown. She thought about how certain she had been in that moment that she was leaving the biggest chapter of her life. And she had been right? She was. But what she had not known then, sitting in that car with one hand on her belly and Vermont somewhere ahead of her, was that leaving the biggest chapter was not the end of the story. It was the condition for the next one. The necessary clearing, the field you burn so that something real can grow. She started the engine. She pulled out of the parking lot onto the road that led back to Kara's house, where her laptop was open on the kitchen table, with 53 pages of a documentary that was going to be extraordinary, where the guest room had become her room in all the ways that mattered, where the life she was building was small and unfinished and entirely, completely hers. Audrey made a sound in the car seat. Not a cry. Just a sound, the particular vocalizing of a baby discovering that her voice exists and can be used. Sophie smiled without looking back. She knew the sound. She knew all her daughter's sounds already. "I know," she said. "We're going home." She drove north on a cold, clear road under a wide winter sky, and she did not look in the rearview mirror once. Not because the past was not real, and not because it had not cost her. It had cost her enormously in ways that would take years to fully account for. But because the road was ahead, because Audrey was beside her, because the story she was writing, the real one, the true one, the one that was entirely hers, was still being written. And it was better than anything she had ever documented. Sophie Hale had not run from her life. She had chosen a new one, and she drove toward it without hesitation, without apology, and without a single moment of doubt that she had earned every mile of the road ahead.